Hi. This is a video I've been meaning to work on for a while. You see, over the past few years, I've been making videos about Thomas the Tank Engine, mainly looking at the original stories and comparing them to their adaptations. But since I've been wanting to branch out into some other content, and those old videos are not my best work, I decided to condense them down into a compilation for you to watch at your leisure. Enjoy!
Thomas and the Breakdown Train. A classic story from the Railway series that many people consider the crowning jewel of the early Wilbur Awdry stories. With an interesting premise, setup, and climax, this is the story that put Thomas the Tank Engine as the front cover poster boy for the rest of the series to follow. But it may surprise you to know that this story has had several interpretations over the years. And today, I'll be looking at and reviewing 4 of them. Starting in order of release, we'll be looking at the original story released in 1946, the original UK broadcast in 1984, the Japanese broadcast and dub in 1990, and finally, 2015's retelling in The Adventure Begins to round out our 4 options. So, without further ado, let's get started with our very first version of this classic story. Original release, October 1946. Acting as the closing story to the second book of the Railway series, this chapter was written by the Reverend Wilbur Awdry and illustrated twice by 2 separate people. Once by Reginald Payne, the original artist of the first 2 books, and then again by Clarence Reginald Darby, who redrew the first book and then modified some illustrations for the second book before doing art for the rest of the series all the way up until Percy the Small Engine. For this review, I'll be showing art from my version of the book, which uses the illustrations of Clarence Reginald Darby. We pick up after the events of Thomas and the Trucks, where we find the little blue tank engine being greeted by the fat director before catching his train. Thomas had been working hard in the yard, having now realized that he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. 3 times now he'd been made a fool of because of his own overconfidence, and he was determined to not let anything happen again. While working in the yard, Thomas comes across some trucks that he's told never to touch.
That's the breakdown train, Thomas. The cranes are for lifting heavy things like engines and coaches and trucks.
A few days later, he hears the blaring of a whistle as an engine comes rushing through. A new engine, one called James, is in trouble. He races past the yard and disappears underneath the bridge. Thomas, who had been in a similar situation not long ago, wishes he could teach the troublesome trucks a lesson. Not long afterward, his opportunity for payback comes sooner than expected.
James is off the line. The breakdown train. Quickly!
As soon as Thomas is coupled on, he sets off to recover the derailed engine. Working his hardest to move the heavy train, the tank engine arrives on the scene. And it's in this scene that we get a great illustration of James's crash. Little details like the broken rail where James came off the line, and his tender laying in a heap with some broken trucks make the scene look very real. Immediately, Thomas sets to work. It takes him all afternoon to sort out the mess, before finally retrieving James. The poor engine is unable to move on his own, so Thomas helps him back to the shed where the fat director was waiting for them. As a reward for his hard work, Thomas is rewarded his very own branch line. Now he's as happy as can be, puffing backwards and forwards with his 2 coaches all day long.
He's never lonely. Edward and Henry stop there quite often and tell him the news. Gordon is always in a hurry and doesn't stop, but he never forgets to say to Thomas, and Thomas in return always whistles.
And now that we have the original story in the books, it's time to move on to our first ever broadcasted version. Original release, 1984. This is the version of the story that most fans are probably familiar with, as it demonstrates a very unique model style that very few shows were doing at the time. Because of the style of this show, the studio didn't need to pay for actors, and instead could allow for a single narrator to voice each of the characters. And who better to take the role as Thomas's first ever narrator than the legendary drummer of the Beatles?
I'd like to be under the sea in an octopus's garden in the shade.
Ringo Starr. Narrating the first 2 seasons of Thomas and Friends, as well as playing Mr. Conductor in its companion series, Ringo brought a very smooth, calm tone to the Thomas and Friends series. Though some people might rag on him for sounding very tired as he narrates, many longtime fans of the series will agree that when needed, he would go above and beyond to give the narration that added touch that made him distinct.
Inspector, he whispered, can you see fish?
The episode itself retells the story fairly accurately to the original books, albeit with some slight differences. The first and most obvious being the introduction of the character James, and his design. Where in the original book, James was based on a Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Class 28 locomotive and had the typical black coat that class came with. In the television series, James was only ever seen with his iconic red livery. Additionally, this story was his original debut in the books, while in the show, he was seen several times before the events of this story. This is of course understandable, as the show didn't have a very big budget at the time, and thus couldn't afford to make a bunch of engines that wouldn't participate in future episodes, as opposed to nowadays where they just create like 12 a day. Some slightly less noticeable changes are the breakdown train consisting of a different set of cars, and James's orientation after he's come off the rails differs considerably to the books. On the music side of things, the tunes heard throughout the first season of Thomas and Friends were composed by Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell, said music being one of the defining elements of Thomas and Friends. Two of the most memorable tracks being the Runaway and Breakdown Train themes, both of which are used in this episode. I personally find the themes both incredibly catchy and perfectly suited for their respective situations. Next up, the Japanese dub, original release October 1990. Now, I'm sure people who grew up with Thomas the Tank Engine didn't even know there was a Japanese dub, and for a long time, neither did I. But it turns out that Thomas was such a big hit in Britain that they decided to license it to other parts of the world.
Look at this dude.
The first thing I'm sure you'll notice as out of the ordinary with this dub is its casting. While the British airing of Thomas and Friends only employed a single narrator for all the engines, the Japanese dub provided several voice actors for all the different characters. For the first 8 seasons of the show, Leo Morimoto was the narrator. Thomas was played by Kaiko Toda. Ketsuji Mori, who you may recognize from shows like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and Dragon Ball Z, lent his voice to James. And Sir Topham Hatt was voiced by Koichi Mahachi. These voice actors definitely bring a lot more energy to the story than the original British dub, which may be a positive or a negative depending on what you're looking for in a viewing experience. I personally found the Japanese dub quite fun to watch due to how different it felt. But the argument could be made that this kind of narration doesn't really fit with the relaxing storybook aesthetic that Thomas and Friends was trying to go for. The music has been unchanged for this dub, though when paired with the higher energy these voice actors bring, it creates a very different viewing experience. I certainly recommend you take a look at this version if you hadn't already, as it's really hard to explain the difference in tone with just words alone. And now, last but not least, the Adventure Begins version. Original release, March 2015. This version was meant to be a reimagining of the classic Wilbur Awdry stories, made from the ground up with all new casting, music, and animation. The driving force behind this story was meant to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Railway series, and features stories ranging from the 3 railway engines all the way up to Thomas the Tank Engine. Rather than being a straight remake of the books, this special is more of an adaptation with a couple elements changed to have it fit more in line with the current CGI series. These changes range from Henry being afraid of the rain rather than being vain about his paintwork, to the events of the story Thomas's train being shown in a little more detail, giving more of a reason to why he left before he was coupled up to his coaches.
Thomas heard the guard's whistle, so he took off before his coaches could be coupled up.
Oh, fuck.
Picking up where the story begins, the first difference is that Thomas isn't alone in the yard when James rushes through. The scene with Sir Topham Hatt doesn't take place either, instead having Edward praise Thomas for having learned about trucks so quickly.
I'm getting on okay now, aren't I?
Of course you are. I think you nearly know as much about cars as I do now.
This was likely done to help the flow of the story, and ultimately these changes aren't that big of a deal. One major change that was made happens once James rushes past. You see, in the original, James rushes past, Thomas hears he's come off the line, and then collects the breakdown train to rescue James. But in this version, instead of just watching him race past, Thomas gives chase. Now, this scene has me undecided on whether I like it or not. On the one hand, it's a really cool scene, made all the better by the advancements in technology. The use of CGI in this scene, and in this special as a whole, was used to great effects, providing angles and scenes that the original models wouldn't be able to do on their own. But on the other hand, it isn't very believable, at least to me, that Thomas would be able to catch up with James, who was going at full speed while he himself started at a standstill. But even if I were to assume he could feasibly catch up to James, the fact that Thomas struggles with reaching the back of the train despite having no trouble getting right up beside James a few moments prior is a little too convenient, even for me. Granted, this special was made mostly for kids, and I wouldn't deny that this scene is quite a step up visually from the original. Anyways, Thomas chases James for a short while, but is unable to slow him down, ending with James coming right off the rails. There are some other differences, like the breakdown train being an actual pair of characters rather than just a couple of cranes, and the Fat Controller arriving at the site of the crash instead of meeting Thomas and James back at the sheds at the end of the day. But aside from those small differences, the scene remains pretty faithful to the original version. Like the Japanese dub, each character has their own distinct voice that make them feel different to one another. Though different voices doesn't quite equate to different voice actors. For instance, if you live in Canada or watch the Canadian-American versions of the special, Joseph May plays Thomas, William Hope plays Edward, Rob Rickshaw is the voice of James, and Keith Wickham is the voice of Sir Topham Hatt. But if you're watching the version released in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, Keith Wickham voices Edward, Henry, Gordon, James, Glyn, Sir Topham Hatt, and several other human characters. Think about that for a second. More than half the cast for this special is played by one guy. I don't know where he finds the voices to do all these characters, but props to him, I guess. Besides the visuals, the score for this special has received a major overhaul. The composer for this soundtrack was one Craig Safan, who I must say did a fantastic job in remastering many of the classic era songs to make them feel familiar, yet distinct. The runaway theme in particular is fantastically haunting to this scene as Thomas chases down the out-of-control James. Next up,
Brake Van, the penultimate story of the twin engines, and one of the most notable stories in the Railway series as a whole. Being an interesting, integral piece in Donald and Douglas's arrival to the Northwestern Railway, this story acts as the perfect way to finish the second act of the book. But it might surprise you to know that this story has had its fair share of interpretations, each one adding and in some ways subtracting from what the original story was trying to say. And today, I will be looking at and reviewing 4 of them. Going in order of release, we'll be looking at the original story released in 1960, followed by the Japanese broadcast and dub in 1991, the US dub of the same year, and last but not least, the Stories of Sodor adaptation in 2017. So, without any delay, let's get started with our very first version of this classic story from the book that started it all, the Railway series. Original release, 1960. Acting as the latter half of the second act of the Twin Engines, this story was written by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, with art done by John T. Kenny, who illustrated the series from the 8 famous engines all the way up until Gallant Old Engine, before having to step down due to developing an eye problem. His art style has more realistic proportions for the faces of the engines, with expressions looking clean and easy to understand. He also softens his colors a little, making visuals easy on the eyes. In my opinion, perfect for a children's bedtime story. This particular story picks up after the events of the missing coach, with the very real threat of being sent away looming over Donald and Douglas. Things don't get any easier for the twins, as a spiteful brake van takes a disliking to Douglas. The van makes a point of causing the Caledonian engine to be late by holding his trains back, further causing tension with Sir Topham Hatt. As a result of this, Donald makes sure to put the van in his place with a hard bump, and a threat to stay in line, or else. While this action causes the van to reconsider making trouble for Donald's twin, it doesn't take long before the number 9 gets into an accident with a signal box. What's interesting about this scene isn't the crash itself, but the conversation between Donald and Sir Topham Hatt.
I did not expect such clumsiness from you. I had decided to send Douglas back and keep you. I'm sorry, sir. But Donald didn't say what he was sorry for. We know, don't we?
The realization that he had just inadvertently saved his twin, who we know from the previous story isn't supposed to be here right now, must have made this whole incident feel more like a stroke of luck than anything else. However, with Donald out of commission, another engine is needed to take his place. And as luck would have it, that engine is James, and he really doesn't take it well. But while he does butt heads with the others, specifically Douglas, the mixed traffic engine soon finds himself struggling with the workload, thanks to a certain spiteful brake van. And with his train being too heavy for him to move on his own, he soon finds himself begging Douglas for assistance.
Help me up the hill, please. These trucks are playing tricks. We'll show 'em.
And show them they do. Douglas proves to be an invaluable partner with this train, evening the odds against the silly trucks. But as they reach Gordon's Hill, things quickly take a turn for the worse. The train proves to be too much for James to handle, even with Douglas's help. Because of his tricks, the brake van that had given Douglas so much trouble is now stuck between a rock and a hard place. It wails out for the trucks to stop holding back, only to buckle as it's crushed between Douglas and the train. Of course, this was by accident, but Sir Topham Hatt is no less cross, and leaves with a line that has Douglas worried for his future.
I want to be fair, Douglas. I admire your determination, but I don't know. I really don't know.
This story features some truly brilliant artwork, be it with the twins, the brake van, or the altercations they get into. It's clear John Kenny was really getting to grips with how to draw Thomas, despite some minor illustration errors. And now with the original story out of the way, it's time to move on to our first ever broadcasted version, the Japanese dub, original release 1991.
厄介者の君など連れて行きたくないもんです。
そうはいかん。俺がいなきゃ困るはずだ。
A lot of people are always surprised when I tell them that there's just as much of a demand for Thomas in Japan as there is in English-speaking countries. The most surprising difference that this dub brings to the table is its casting. While most versions of the show as we know them have one actor doing the lines for all the characters in the story, the Japanese dub utilizes several voice actors. And the story of Brake Van is no different. In this episode, Donald is voiced by Yuki Satao, Douglas is voiced by Takeshi Endo, Kitsuji Mori lends his voice to James, Kohi Miyachi plays Sir Topham Hatt, and the role of the titular Brake Van goes to Shinobu Satoshi. Quite the extensive cast, wouldn't you say? While Thomas's results with a larger voice cast have been hit or miss to say the least, I do think the Japanese dub does a good job at bringing more personality to these characters than the English dubs. There is of course the argument that this narration doesn't really fit with Thomas and Friends, a show originally based off a series of bedtime stories. But my gosh, I can't help but love these line deliveries. On the visual side of things, this episode was made entirely with models and practical effects, and it captures the original story fairly well. The model style, in my opinion, hasn't aged a day. The first 11 seasons of the show were filmed with this style before making the transition to CGI. And while this transition could allow for angles, shots, and movements not possible in series prior, I think the classic series does literally everything else better. That's not to say this version doesn't have its issues, of course. The camera never stops bouncing, the entire episode has been crunched together with the story Hullo Twins, completely skipping over the missing coach. And once you notice this, you'll never unsee it. But aside from those issues, I think that the models blow anything CGI can do out of the water. On the music side of things, the first 2 seasons of Thomas and Friends were composed by Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell. While most children's shows these days have fairly lackluster, generic, and often forgettable soundtracks, the original themes from Thomas and Friends would go down in history as the quintessential example of how important a soundtrack to a medium is. The standout theme in this episode has to be Donald and Douglas's theme. Next up, the US version, original release 1991. It's genuinely surprising to me how it took nearly 10 years for America to get their own version of this episode, considering they're usually first in line when it comes to content from other countries. The US dubbing of the show is probably the version of this story that most of you watching are familiar with. While the UK would be the first to get an English dub of this episode, when it came time to bring the series over to the States, the original narrator, Ringo Starr, had left production. Thus, if they wanted the show to continue, the team behind Thomas and Friends would have to find someone else to fill the role. And who better to fill said role than... Shut the fuck up! Shut the fuck up! George Carlin. This vulgar, offensive, but downright hilarious comedic icon quickly became synonymous with Thomas the Tank Engine, appearing as both the narrator for the show and as Mr. Conductor on Shining Time Station.
Masturbation is not illegal, replied the conductor. But if it were, people would probably take the law into their own hands. And remember, this is Mr. Conductor talking. I know what I'm talking about.
He features a much more organic, natural style of narration, and expresses much more nuance while voicing the different engines than Ringo Starr. And I think no characters embody that more than his take on Donald and Douglas. First I'll play Ringo's version, and then we'll see how George Carlin compares.
"You're a muckle nuisance," said Donald. "It's to leave you behind I'd be wanting." "You can't," said the van. "I'm essential."
"Ah, are you?" Donald burst out. "You're nothing but a screeching and a noise when all's said and done. Spite doggy, would you? Take that!" "Oh! Oh!" cried the van. "There's more coming should you misbehave."
You should be able to tell straight away that George puts a great deal of effort to make Donald and Douglas sound Scottish, as that's where they're from. And while Ringo's narration isn't bad, it lacks that characteristic that George nails perfectly.
Well, well, well. Surely, James, it wasn't you. You didn't say.
And now, our final version, Carriages by Victor Tanzik. Original release, April 2017. Now, I can hear the comment section now, calling me out for putting a fan creation in this review, but this entry is a bit special. For as long as YouTube has existed, there's been fans who want to create their own Thomas and Friends stories. Spin-offs, original stories, and retellings of classic ones have never really been in short supply. And while many of them are very well made, and show a great respect to the source material, I feel that narratively, structurally, and thematically, this telling of Breakfan is on another level to what's been done before. The Stories of Sodor, created by Victor Tanzik, is a Thomas Tuggs hybrid series that tries to paint Sodor in a more realistic setting. Many changes, alterations, and story beats have been rewritten to change the island's history while still fitting into the context of the Railway series. For the most part, but we'll get to that. The series has been made with the use of Train Simulator, a program that was intended for running realistic trains on realistic layouts, but quickly turned into the go-to Thomas and Friends fan story machine. And honestly, it can be hit or miss at points. Don't get me wrong, when used correctly, the program can produce some stunning cinematography, rivaling that of even the CGI series, but it does have its limits. And when you push those limits, it can produce some interesting results. Thankfully, even during the first episodes of Stories of Sodor, Victor Tanzik knew very well what he was doing. He doesn't get fancy, and he doesn't do anything too ambitious on a visual front, and I think that's for the better. No, the ambitious part comes with the narrative, and boy, am I looking forward to talking about that. For this particular story, I'm going to be breaking up the original video and looking at just where the events of Breakfan pick up. Mostly because there's a whole other plot involving coaches and the narrow gauge railway that's mostly disconnected from the main story, and covering it could be an entire video in its own right. The first difference in the story shows up as soon as the Breakfan appears. In the original story, the spiteful Breakfan was known as just that, the spiteful Breakfan. But in Victor Tanzik's version, he actually is a name, Dominic. An interesting way to humanize the character, and one that I think works to the story's benefit. This isn't some nameless piece of rolling stock, but a living, thinking being. Another, more noticeable difference comes about during this scene. After giving Dominic a bump and telling him to keep in line, Donald is reprimanded by a police engine and punished accordingly, as his actions constitute assault. Again, it's small changes like these that make the story feel much more real. There was an action, a reaction, and a consequence. And that brings us to this scene. With Douglas helping an ill-feeling James of Gordon's Hill, Dominic crying out for help as the wood he's made of begins to splinter, and then... This scene works incredibly well in the context of the world Victor Tanzik has created. In the original version, the Breakfan crumples in half, sure, but no one really reacts to the fact that someone literally was just crushed. In some ways, that makes the story more realistic. It's just a Breakfan after all. But in this version, when Dominic gets smashed up, he dies. And boy, is there a reaction. Douglas and James are brought down to the station, and Douglas has his turn being grilled by the police. Again, there's an action, a reaction, and a consequence. These aren't just engines, they're alive. They have laws they have to follow, and I don't think I've ever seen this concept really tackled in a Thomas anything before. The episode ends on a very somber note as the Caledonian engine takes great shame in what he's done. As far as the story goes, this is a great rendition for older fans to enjoy. It has its ups, its downs, and is able to play things as straight as possible for the sake of the plot. On the side of voice acting, I'm genuinely surprised at how versatile Victor Tanzik is. He voices every character in this story, and in the entire series as a whole. Some of his standout impressions in this episode have to be Donald and Douglas.
You're a muckle nuisance. It's to leave you behind I'd be wanting.
And of course, James.
Another signal box got smashed up, and he wants to know if you had anything to do with it.
But that's not to say this version doesn't have its problems here and there. For starters, the presentation. While his pacing is good and narratively solid, you may notice in Victor's earlier work that he likes to jump from one angle to another in quick succession. And while yes, the classic series did do this too, that show wasn't as dialogue heavy as the Stories of Sodor is. What's more apparent in this first season is that Victor would often reuse footage to extend a scene, which has the somewhat funny effect of having Douglas appear lower on the hill than he actually is. It's also apparent that there had to be a little bit of give and take with Dominic getting crushed, as Trains doesn't really have that sort of mechanic in place. In saying that, I think Victor did the best with what he could, and for that I have to applaud him. These are ultimately small mistakes, and most of them were patched out for later episodes, but I figured I'd at least mention them nonetheless. On the music side of things, since this is entirely a one-person production, most of the music is either borrowed from Thomas and Friends, Tugs, or straight up royalty-free music that fits surprisingly well. Overall, I find the music serviceable, not overly distracting, and not mixed so loudly that you can't hear what the characters are trying to say. Next up, Super Rescue. Few Railway series stories are as talked about as this gem. The climax of Henry's arc, and the only story from Enterprising Engines not to be adapted by the classic series. Or is it? This may come as a shock to some of you, but there are plenty of interpretations both officially and unofficially that tell the story of Super Rescue just as well as the books. And today, I will be looking at and reviewing 4 of them. Going in order of release, we'll be looking at the original story released in 1968, the rewritten version in Edward the Very Useful Engine from 2002, the remake by Comic Fan in 2022, and the Trains remake by Omai Sodor of the same year to round out our 4 options. So, without further ado, let's start things off with the book we all know and love, The Railway Series. Original release, 1968. This story acts as a semi-sequel to the previous story, Tenders for Henry, and was written by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry. The art for this book was done by Gunvor and Peter Edwards, who illustrated the series from Stepney the Bluebell Engine all the way up until Tramway Engines, which also happens to be the final book Awdry wrote before his passing in 1997. Something I find really sweet is that despite being the sole illustrator for the remainder of Awdry's original series, Peter actually shared the credit with his wife. As for the art itself, while I don't love every illustration they've made, the work done in this story specifically is outstanding. Facial expressions are clean, the detail is incredible, and the engines feel giant in a way that the other illustrations haven't been able to capture. But visuals aside, how about that story? We pick things up with 2 diesels arriving at the sheds, before trading remarks with the steam engines.
Our controller says, steam engines spoil our image. Of course we do. We show what frauds you are. Call yourselves engines? If anything happens, you care nothing for your train. You just moan for a fitter. We bring it home, if only on 1 cylinder.
While it's a small thing, I do like that one of the diesels actually tries to shut the other one up. Diesels in Thomas and Friends are usually portrayed as not nice to be around. See Diesel, Airy, Bert, etc. So having nicer characters like Boko, or in this case 7101, that offset that stereotype is quite nice. We then hard cut to the next day, with Henry returning to the yard after having broken down.
I'm a failed engine. Lost my regulator. Driver says it jammed wide open, and it can't mend it till I'm cool. Worse and worse. Now old Reliable will laugh at me too.
But the diesel is too busy eating his own words to notice Henry. With a failed engine, Spam Can is blocking the line for an approaching passenger train being pulled by the nicer of the 2 diesels. Even in his current state, Henry gets right to work moving the broken down diesel and his train out of the way. But we soon find out that 7101 is having problems of his own. Despite his best efforts, 7101's train grinds to a halt. This presents Henry and his crew with a unique situation. Both trains need to get to their destination, and Henry is the only engine available. But moving 2 diesels and their trains is no joke for a failed engine. Despite that, Henry decides to give it his best shot. Getting Spam Can into motion, Henry buffers up behind 7101, ready to start the journey. With a lot of effort, the cavalcade pulls into the station to the sound of cheers from the other engines. The story ends with Henry revealing to 7101 the lengths he'd gone to get both their trains to their destination.
You failed, and yet... 7101 said no more. He had a lot to think about.
It's easy to see how this story is a favorite among fans. Having Henry, the character that started out as the most pathetic of the lot, end up being the one to move 2 entire trains is one of the most satisfying arcs of the entire series. And while I think this is the perfect way to cap off such an interesting arc, I do have a couple issues with the story that bring it down a couple pegs for me personally. First and foremost, I think the story could have been written a little more coherently. This story feels like it's missing a couple lines of text in a few places, specifically at the start of the story and right after 7101 breaks down. Things just feel a bit too disjointed for my liking. This doesn't make or break the story by any means, but it is something that I noticed while going through these different versions. Other than that though, I think this story more than deserves the praise it's gotten over the years. It's the last Henry story before Chris took over, and it's undoubtedly one of the best. Next up, Edward the Very Useful Engine. Original release, 2002. I'm sure most of you watching right now have probably never considered this story to be an adaptation of Super Rescue, given that the overall story is written very differently. Heck, none of the characters from the Railway series actually have starring roles in this episode. And sure, when you say it like that, I can see where you're coming from. But I, for one, think that this story not only puts a brand new spin on Super Rescue, but does it incredibly well. This version begins with the big engines, more so Gordon, talking about how Edward is slow, old, and should be taken out of service. Something that an impressionable Percy is very upset about. After all, Edward was basically his mentor when he first arrived on the railway. Word gets back to Sir Topham Hatt about this bad-mouthing of the Elder Engine, and he begins formulating a plan to teach Gordon a lesson. See, this episode sets up Edward as the unsung hero that helps engines over Gordon's Hill. And so, Sir Topham Hatt sends the Blue Engine to work elsewhere while Duck takes over. And while Duck is a hard worker, he doesn't have Edward's experience when it comes to handling trucks. Something that's quick to bite him when...
halfway up Gordon's Hill, his wheels stopped altogether. Duck was stuck.
And wouldn't you know it, Gordon's coming down the same No, he doesn't crash into Duck, but he is forced to stop so he can give the Great Western Engine a push. Only to find that between the heavy coaches and Duck's freight cars, he can't get either train moving. Now with 2 engines stuck on the hill, it's time to call in the professional. Edward buffers up to Gordon's Express, and the strange train sets off. When they reach the next station, Gordon is reprimanded by Sir Topham Hatt and ordered to apologize to Edward for his earlier comments. And thus, the episode ends with Edward accepting Gordon's apology, having proved that he's just as useful as he ever has been. While this adaptation is not a one-to-one recreation of the original story, it's still an incredibly fun ride from beginning to end, and is a great example of taking an old story to make something entirely new. In fact, I'd say that this story actually has a leg up on the original in a few ways, mostly in regards to how it's written. In Super Rescue, Henry kinda comes out of nowhere for the second act, which, while cool, makes the whole thing feel a little disconnected. Comparatively, this version of the story sets up and pays off all of its key plot points without any wasted motion. Sure, there's no steam versus diesel subplot here, but there honestly doesn't need to be one. Moving over to the presentation, this episode was adapted using live models and sets. A lot of people go off on Season 6 for having a dull color scheme, and while I'll admit it's not as cinematic looking as the season prior, I actually like this season's looks just as much. It's more industrial in nature, and while it's clearly a course correct after Magic Railroad, I don't see the lighting and colors being a bit more subdued as bad, just more realistic. As for the music, Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell were the composers for Season 6, and continue to hit it out of the park with their themes. I want to give special attention to Gordon's theme this time around. While it doesn't play for very long in this episode, what is here is just so good. Now then, on to the big point of contention with this episode, the narrators. We've got 3 of them to pick from today. Let's start off with the one you've probably all heard at least once, Alec Baldwin. Like with the visual shift between Season 5 and 6, Alec's narration was toned down by a few notches. The big bombastic voices he had for each character were reined in, and his overall pacing is much more streamlined. If people aren't pointing to the visuals of Season 6 as a negative, they're usually pointing to this narration. And once again, I have to disagree. I think the narration is no better, nor any worse than what George Carlin was doing in seasons prior. Not every character needs an overly cartoony voice, and in some cases, I think the vocal change was actually a big improvement.
Harold thinks he can go faster than me. I'll show him.
It makes no difference to me, said Gordon pompously. I don't need a back engine.
In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that the more realistic voices add to what's supposed to be a more realistic season. Like him or hate him, however, Alec Baldwin is only one piece of the puzzle. On the UK side of things, we have Michael Angelis. To all you British folk out there, you probably need no introduction to this man. Michael Angelis has been one of Thomas's longest running narrators, picking up where Ringo Starr left off back in season 3. While I personally prefer George Carlin and Alec Baldwin's narration styles overall, when it comes to this episode in particular, Angelis is simply incredible. He's got great energy, his deliveries are on point, and he overall just knocks it out of the park.
If I stop on this hill, I'll never get started again, he said crossly, and he buffered up to Duck.
And then there's Michael Brandon. Oh boy, where do I begin? I want to start by saying that I don't necessarily think Michael Brandon is a bad narrator. He's had plenty of line deliveries during his Thomas tenure that I think are honestly really well done. His tone of voice during spooky or otherwise tense scenes are spot on, and it honestly feels like he's at his best during these moments.
They puff slowly through the piles of jagged steel and twisted scrap.
A lot of the stuff I don't like about his narration comes down to the stories he's telling, and that's not his fault. That's on the writers and their lazy copy-paste storylines. But, with that being said, I don't think he's a good Thomas narrator. I think that if this were any other kids show, he'd be doing a perfectly fine job, and that mostly comes down to his inflection. The one thing Brandon lacks that Ringo, George, Angelis, and Baldwin are all able to nail down perfectly is their tone of voice. They all have a sort of edge to them, and they never, ever sound like they're talking down to the audience.
I only wish, sir, he said gravely, that I'd thought of those names myself. If the dome fits. Sir Topham Hatt recovered. He'd been trying not to laugh himself.
Even when the material at hand isn't great, and trust me, there's certainly a few that aren't great, they at least manage to make them all a little bit enjoyable. Michael Brandon, however, doesn't have any edge to him at all. He's like a pillow. Sure, that could come down to the voice direction Hit was giving him, which again, isn't his fault, but it's still not a good vocal performance. And this also carries over to his voices, of which most of the time he defaults to this high-pitched nasally voice that I can't stand for the life of me.
But sir, he asked, who will look after the freight cars? Duck is very reliable, said Henry.
Duck should play with other ducks, 'cause he's no good at pulling trucks. Quack, 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 hold back, hold back.
This version also isn't helped by the fact that the Mike and Jr. soundtracks have been replaced by Robert Hartshorn's melodies, which are frustrating. They're more akin to proper background music than Mike and Jr.'s, but I just can't find myself humming one of them off the top of my head. They're not bad, they're just more generic and forgettable in my opinion. Now then, moving on to the next version, the recreation by Comic Fan, original release 2022. This version is one that most of you watching probably haven't even known existed up until now.
Ooh, that's kind of small.
But like with Edward the Very Useful Engine, I think this one makes a few improvements on the original story. Having been made by YouTube user ComicFan13, this adaptation has been made entirely through the use of live sets and take-along models, while also being shot and written in the style of Thomas's second season. And I'm happy to say that that season 2 feel is absolutely there. All of the plot points are basically the same, just swapping out Spam Can and 7101 for Diesel and Daisy respectively. But the story is streamlined to what I'd consider near perfection. Sure, it still feels like it's been broken down into 2 halves, but the clunky exposition is all gone and the jokes were adapted to fit the story's history quite well.
For pity's sake, take this weasel away. He's failed. Weasel? Stow it, you. You cause enough trouble as it is.
Heck, the existence of this episode alone proves that Super Rescue could have been adapted without having to invent 2 new characters. On the visual side of things, this adaptation has a very old-school YouTube feel to it, and I mean that in the best possible way. While I do think that the lighting could use some improvement, and maybe a few shots could have been added here and there, I think the sets and visuals look perfectly fine for a one-person production. They're simple, but charming in their own way. Yeah, that's the word I'd use to describe this version of the story. Charming. It doesn't try to do too much, and it works within its limitations to be as good as it can be.
Duck, take Diesel back to the other railway. I'll write my report later. With pleasure, sir.
And finally, the remake by Omai Sodor. Original release, 2022. We're back to the original story for this one, complete with the narration by Willie Rushton. To avoid repeating myself, all the critiques I had about the original story still hold true for this version. So instead, let's focus on the presentation. This take on Super Rescue was made entirely with Train Simulator, and boy oh boy does it look and sound fantastic. The lighting, the low-angle shots on the engines, and the music are all incredibly impressive. It's clear that a lot of care and thought went into each shot and accompanying song. Speaking of which, while a sizable chunk of the music isn't Thomas related, I think it fits just as well. And I might go as far as to say that this is the definitive version of the story, if it wasn't for one glaring issue. Have you noticed it? Yep, right there. That big, bare smokebox door where a face is supposed to be. Let me tell you why this bothers me. Now, we're all drawn to Thomas for different reasons. Maybe you like the show, the books, the toys, what have you. But the one thing that makes Thomas in my mind is the faces on the trains. Something so simple but so crucial to getting that emotional connection with the characters. Take that off, and all you have are these emotionless, lifeless machines. And whether that was a stylistic choice or not for this adaptation, I think it is a major downgrade, and completely misses the mark of what makes Thomas and Friends special. Without the face, the train isn't a character, it's just a train. A very cool looking train, but a train nonetheless. Each version of the story I've gone over thus far has had some asterisks attached to it. Something that makes me say, oh, it's good, but followed by a negative that I think could have been fixed with a little more tweaking. Better lighting, another rewrite, but I think this is probably the biggest asterisk I could give one of these options. It's so close to being perfect, but the lack of any expression from the stars of the show makes me not care about these engines at all. This might as well just be stock footage of real trains vaguely following the story they're trying to tell. Next up, Escape. What can I even say about this one? A standout story from the Railway series that follows the incredibly exciting tale of Oliver's arrival on the Northwestern Railway. With high stakes and incredible real-life inspiration, this story has more than earned its spot as one of the greats. And with a great story comes great adaptations. Ones that not only rival the original, but change the context, themes, and even mediums to make something truly stand out. And today, I will be looking at and reviewing 4 of them. Going in order of release, I'll be looking at the original story released in 1968, the Model Series version from 1992, the NWR Origins version from 2016, and the Stories of War version from 2018 to round out our 4 options. So with all that out of the way, let's kick things off with the book that started it all, the Railway series. Original release, 1968. Coming right off the heels of the already incredible Super Rescue, a story I looked at last time, this story was written by the Reverend Wilbert Audrey and illustrated by Gunvor and Peter Edwards. At the risk of repeating myself from Super Rescue, the art in this story is absolutely phenomenal. If there's one thing that Gunvor and Peter excelled at throughout their tenure in the Railway series, it was the use of dynamic lighting. Dark blues mixed with pale yellows really helped to sell the eeriness of the other railway. And when we finally see the sunrise cut through the night, it hits just right. But you know me, pretty colors are only one piece of the puzzle. Let's have a look at that story. We pick things up with Douglas on the other railway as he sorts out his midnight goods train, only to stop when he hears something peculiar.
Who's there? Are you a Fat Controller's engine? Aye, I'm proud of it.
The engine introduces himself as Oliver, along with his coach Isabella and his brake van Toad. They've been trying to escape to the island of Sodor when they ran out of coal, and are now stuck on a railway infested with diesels. Having escaped from Scrap himself, Douglas, without hesitation, offers to help the trio. Their crew set to work making the arrangements, painting Scrap everywhere they can and shunting Oliver onto the front of Douglas's train. And they're just about to make their great escape when...
Hee-hee! A steamer's escaping! Yoo-hoo!
This scene had me tensed when I first read it, and the sigh of relief I had when Douglas was allowed to leave was immense. And as the 2 engines head off, Oliver reveals that that wasn't even their closest call.
We ran at night. We got on well till Control heard about a mystery train. Then they tried to hunt us down. A signalman let us hide on an old quarry branch. Driver, fireman and guard blocked the cutting with rubbish. We stayed there for days, with diesels baying and growling like hounds outside. I was very frightened then.
Crossing into their own borders, Oliver is stowed away on an empty siding, and the story ends just as the sun is beginning to rise. Needless to say, this story is fantastic, and it acts as a perfect bookend to Douglas's story. To think the stowaway who caused trouble everywhere he went would end up saving another of his kind is a wonderful way to cap off an arc. I also love that Douglas's story concludes right as Oliver's story kicks off. And if future books are any indication, it was more than a worthwhile trade-off. And now with the original story out of the way, it's time to move on to the classic series. Original release, 1992. Like with many classic series adaptations, this story has been stripped down to its most important elements and changed just enough to make it feel distinct. And honestly, I think all the changes fit the story perfectly. And I love how events from Season 2 with Trevor are brought up in the story. While I do love the books version, that little bit of extra setup is something that the initial story was really lacking in my opinion. It gives this episode a proper 3-act structure, and makes Douglas's choice to rescue Oliver all the more poignant. Another change I love is how this story ends. Instead of having the resolution to the story take place in its own episode, Escape combines its RWS counterpart with Little Western, making things feel all the more connected. On the side of cinematography, oh baby does this episode have amazing shots in spades. Some of my favorites in all of Thomas and Friends if I'm being honest. This shot of Donald and Oliver passing through the darkness is brilliant, and when they cross the border while shrouded in that orange light, you couldn't ask for a better visual. For narration, we have two Thomas legends at the helm, George Carlin and Michael Angelis. Both of these narrators made their debuts in Season 3, and they're both fantastic. George's voices for Douglas and Oliver are spot on.
"Who's there?" asked Douglas. A whisper came. "Are you Sir Topham Hatt's engine?" "Aye, and proud of it." "Well, I'm Oliver, and I'm with my brake van Toad. We've run out of coal and have no more steam."
And Michael Angelis's deliveries are perfect as ever.
"And you and he have a lot in common too." "Och, aye," quizzed Douglas. "And what'd that be?" "Scrap." Douglas gasped. "Don't mention that word. It makes my wheels wobble."
I honestly can't choose a favorite between these two. They're both great. Finally, we have the music. And I mean, just listen to this. I don't think it's a hot take to say that this song is better than it has any right to be. Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell composed the music for Thomas's third season, and they took things to a level that can keep up with the best composers on modern-day kids shows. Thomas is a show that only works because people gave a shit, and no aspect of the classic series conveys that better than the music. Next up, NWR Origins, original release, 2016. For those unaware, NWR Origins is a series created by YouTube user T1E2H3 and acts as a prologue to their main series, The Engines of Sodor. The entire series is made using Train Simulator and covers the origins and arrival of various Thomas characters. When this series came out back in 2016, I thought it was the coolest thing at the time. A series about Sodor's early days? What a unique and original idea! To be fair, as someone who didn't have any interest in the CGI stuff at the time, this was a really cool concept. And of course, what origin story of Sodor would be complete without one of its most notable members, Oliver? Spanning 2 episodes, this story focuses entirely on Oliver's life pre-Sodor and his escape to the railway. The first episode shows us what things were like for him on the Great Western Railway, and we even get to see how him and Toad first met. Then, things begin to take a turn for the worse as we see diesels creeping their way onto the railway. Smaller ones at first, but soon, bigger and stronger ones begin taking work away from the steam engines. It gets so bad that Oliver's brothers are withdrawn from service, leaving him all alone in his little shed. Until one day, he finds out that he too is bound for the scrapyard, as are Toad and Isabella. Something that I really like about this story is as time progresses, the colors become more and more faded, signifying how dire things are. Everything Oliver cares about is being taken away from him, and when he finds out that he's next in line for the Cutter's Torch, he's crushed.
Oliver, wake up!
Huh? What's going on?
Come on, boy. We're getting you out of here. We're leaving.
Oliver's driver and firemen explain the plan. If they aren't wanted here on the Great Western Railway, then they'll just head to a place that does want them, the island of Sodor. Oliver is quickly steamed up and readied for the journey. But just as they're about to leave, he makes a request to bring a couple friends along for the ride. From there, Oliver, Isabella, and Toad make their escape, traveling only at night to avoid being spotted, until one night, they're stopped by a signalman while en route. Knowing that diesels are looking for the cavalcade, the signalman instructs Oliver and his crew to hide on an old quarry branch line, a very clever nod to the original story. Unfortunately, 2 straight nights of running without any time to refuel has left Oliver low on coal, and so his crew leave him on the siding to go look for some. Days pass, and diesel engines continuously stalk the line where Oliver is hiding. Finally, his crew return with what little wood they could find. The driver reckons they can make it to Sodor in one more run, but Oliver isn't so sure. Still, they don't have many options available to them, and once the last diesel is passed by for the night, Oliver sets out for one more sprint. But despite his determination, they can only go so far with so little fuel, and it isn't long before Oliver comes to a screeching halt on the main line. And as you can imagine, it's not hard for him to be spotted by a pair of diesels. The Great Western engine is dragged to the scrapyard, and left in a siding to be dealt with. He ends up sitting there for days, and is just about to resign himself to his fate when...
I've not heard a sound like that since... Oh, Glory, wake up, everyone!
It's Douglas, and after getting his attention, the two make their big escape. And from here, the rest is history. This version of the story is certainly an interesting take on the events. Oliver being the POV character of the story isn't something I thought I wanted, but I'm so glad we got. Like I said, I thought this was the coolest thing ever when it came out, and if I were to review the story back then, I'd have nothing but good things to say about it. But this is present day me, not 2016 me. And while I can say that this was very good at the time, it certainly hasn't aged well. Oh hi, Fraps watermark, I didn't see you there. For starters, this story has some major scripting problems. Dialogue feels really clunky in a lot of areas, and at some points, characters feel like they're having 2 different conversations with one another.
Toad, you are absolutely right. Even if the chance is microscopic, it's still a chance.
Mr. Oliver, no matter what you say, I know you at life depths, and I'm going to call you Mr. Oliver, whether you like it or not.
It's not helped by the fact that this story features multiple voice actors, which is just begging for things to go wrong. Now, I don't mean to say that the voice actors themselves did a bad job, although some of these line deliveries don't do it for me. No, what I mean is that it's so obvious that these actors were just given their lines and told to read and record them without any direction. And because of this, characters will say things in a way that doesn't sound right, and sometimes they just blow their mics out completely. Another issue that I have on the side of voice acting, and this is getting really nitpicky, is how the lines are edited together. Even without wearing headphones, I was able to count many times where the voice actor for Oliver smacked his lips after finishing a sentence.
The 60s saw an exponential drop in steam engines. Soon, on average, we only had 2 trains a day.
Now, obviously that's not his fault. Lip smacking happens during voice work. But I will dock points on T1, E2, H3 for not picking up on these issues and cleaning up the audio a little. Audio on its own is an entire rabbit hole that I could talk about for honestly way too long, so let's just move on. On the music side of things, T1, E2, H3 uses whichever music suits the scene best, whether it be copyrighted or not. And honestly, his choices for music are pretty darn good. I think my favorite piece has to be the one that plays as Oliver makes his big escape from the Great Western Railway. And I would play it for you, but I don't fancy getting a copyright strike for a song that may or may not be protected under fair use. Hey, I'll use Sudbury and Afro's music until the cows come home, but I ain't gonna gamble with this. Overall, while this version of the story has its issues, mainly on the technical side, I will concede that these are only issues that technically minded people like myself will care about. As far as the story goes, there's not much I would change, and I can't say there isn't a lot of heart put into the video. Not to mention an incredibly satisfying shot to wrap up the season finale. And last, but certainly not least, Atrocities by Victor Tanzik. Original release, 2018. Atrocities serves as the finale to the Stories of War, a mini-series that asks the question, what if Thomas was in World War II? You heard me, not what if World War II was happening around Thomas. No, Thomas is there on the battlefield. Had someone pitched this idea to me back in 2018, I would have said they were fucking nuts. I mean, Thomas fighting with a gun in World War II? That sounds ridiculous. And yet, Victor Tanzik not only took the idea and ran with it, but did it so gosh dang well that the Stories of War could have legitimately been the finale to the Stories of Sodor. I could make an entire video talking about how good this short series is, but that is a story for another day. For now, let's stick to what we know. Like NWR Origins, the Stories of War was made in Train Simulator and honestly looks fantastic. Sure, it might not be made in the version of Trains with all the fancy lighting and other effects, but that's by no means to say it can't produce some stunning visuals. That combined with the simplistic, less is more style that Victor Tanzik's videos are known for, helps everything come together very well. Everything on screen serves a purpose and moves just enough for your mind to fill in the blanks. There's still some camera movements that are a little janky, seeing as Trains isn't built for movements like that, but this is still a major step up in terms of quality from the last time I talked about the stories of Sodor. So the video looks good, but what about the story? The adaptation picks up calmly enough, with Thomas and Douglas double-heading a goods train to the front lines when...
What was that? It sounded like... Incoming!
A Nazi airstrike catches them off guard. As the platoon retreats, Thomas and Douglas break free from their train and race off down the line just as it's hit by an enemy shell. It isn't until nightfall that the two engines stop running, finding themselves well behind enemy lines. And it's not long before they hear the thundering noise of another engine coming their way. The two make a mad dash for an abandoned yard, just barely escaping the sight of a massive steam engine. All the while set to an incredible piece of music that feels tense yet oddly ethereal at the same time. With few options at their disposal, the two engines try to contact their platoon over the radio, only to find out that they're not alone.
Who's there? Are you Fat Controller's engines? Aye, I'm proud of it. Oh, thank goodness! I'm Oliver, and I'm with my brake van Toad. We've run out of coal and have no more steam.
With Oliver's discovery, the three engines formulate a plan. One way or another, they're getting back to their own lines. Back at base camp, the other engines are licking their wounds after the thrashing they've received. They too are coming up with a plan to save their friends. And come daybreak, an assault on the Nazis goes into full swing. What follows is honestly one of my favorite sequences Victor Tanzik has ever produced. We very seldom get to see the engines in combat during the stories of war, but the two times that we do see some action are honestly incredible. There's this thick sense of chaos and desperation as the fight rages on. We don't know if our guys have the edge or not, but damn if they're not doing everything they can to save Thomas and Douglas. The second a gap in Nazi forces open up, Thomas, Oliver, Douglas, and Toad make a break for it, only to find that the Nazis aren't going to let them leave so easily. In a second, two massive steam engines are hot on their tail, with Thomas, Douglas, and Toad staring death right in the face. And just when it looks like it's over for the escaping engines, a massive relief fills the air as the cavalcade pass by their friends. They've just barely escaped with their lives and live to tell the tale. This story is a trip. Even going back to rewatch it for this video, I could feel the intensity of the situation. There's not an ounce of hyperbole in my voice when I say Atrocity is one of Victor Tanzik's best episodes, and this sequence contributes to that sentiment in a major way. As an adaptation of the original story, I can see why some people might not like it. Plopping Thomas in the middle of World War II is a somewhat silly idea on paper, and would have never flown in the Railway series. Heck, a story like this would have made Wilbert Awdry have a fit. But in that same breath, there aren't many Railway series stories that get me as hyped as this sequence of events does. And if having a thrilling, action-packed story that keeps you on the edge of your seat means it has to bend a few rules, I'd say it is more than a fair trade. Next up, the underdog. Few story tropes get an audience as hyped as watching the little guy overcome impossible odds. Whether it be a movie, sporting event, or TV series, we all love seeing someone pull away with an unlikely win. And on the island of Sodor, underdog stories are in no short supply. No matter if it's a railway at stake or a promise to be kept, the determination of the Fat Controller's engines is nearly boundless, leading to some incredibly thrilling stories, both official and fan-made. And today, I will be looking at and reviewing 8 of them. Going in no particular order, I'll be looking at Edward's Exploit, Percy's Promise, Gallant Old Engine, Henry's Hero, Edward's Fun Run, Rescue and Redemption, End of the Line for Edward, and finally, Fire Escape to round out our 8 options. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's not waste any more time. First up to bat, Edward's Exploit. Original release, 1966 and 1986. Edward's exploit acts as the finale to the Railway series book, Mainline Engines, and was written by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry. Art for this story was done by the ever-fantastic Gunvor and Peter Edwards, and the story proved to be so good, it was later adapted into an episode for the second season of Thomas and Friends. The story starts with the bigger engines watching as Edward struggles out of the station with a heavy passenger train, to which Duck and a new diesel engine named Boko take great exception to.
Did you see him straining? Asked Henry. Positively painful, remarked James. Just pathetic, grunted Gordon. He should give up, be preserved before it's too late. Shut up, burst out Duck. Edward's better than any of you. You're right, Duck. Edward's old, but he'll surprise us all.
Depending on which version you're looking at, this exchange either takes place in the yard after Edward has already left, or at the station with the older engines still in earshot. Despite their comments, Edward does eventually get the heavy train moving, and brings the visitors to the China Clay Pits, where they meet Bill and Ben, two more characters that were introduced in this book. On their way home, however, the weather takes a turn for the worse, and Edward finds himself in an uphill battle against heavy wind and rain. Despite things already looking bad, the worst is yet to come. Edward's side rod comes loose, swinging up and brutally tearing into his frame. I absolutely love this illustration of Edward as his crew look him over. You can tell he's in pain right now, and he's just barely keeping it together. His crew try to make what little repairs they can, taking his side rods off just to get him moving again. With his pulling power cut in half, Edward is faced with the most difficult challenge of his life. Not rescuing a runaway, banking a heavy freight train, or pulling the express. No, he has to somehow move this heavy passenger train by himself uphill on one axle. His crew back him down to where the line is more level, but he just can't get the coaches into motion. He just doesn't have the strength. But as the saying goes, strength is relative when a little leverage is applied.
Driver, fireman and guard went along the train, making adjustments between the coaches. We've loosened the couplings, Edward, they said. Now you can pick your coaches up one by one, just as you do with trucks. That will be much easier, said Edward gratefully.
With the couplings on his coaches adjusted, Edward cautiously moves forward. The first coach moving helps to start the second helps the third, and so on down the train. And before he's realized it, Edward's got the train moving again. While the journey is by no means easy from here on out, Edward manages to limp the train home on the equivalent of a broken leg, where Henry is waiting to take it on. The passengers cheer Edward and his crew to the echo before disappearing into the departing train. And the story ends with Edward returning to the sheds, battered, weary, but unbeaten, having proven once and for all that he's not the old, out-of-date engine that everyone thinks he is. I can see why this story, and Edward as a character, are a favorite to many. The engine from yesteryear who's had to prove himself time after time after time, finally gets his moment to show that when the going gets tough, he's got more grit and determination than any of the big engines. Unlike James, he doesn't fret about his appearance. Unlike Henry, he doesn't hide away at the first sign of trouble. And unlike Gordon, he doesn't throw in the towel when he's given some pushback. Edward simply bears down and carries on. And I think that both the Railway series and Model series do the story quite well. But that's not to say I think they're both perfect. In fact, I think Edward's exploit is a perfect example of the adaptation and original not having all the pieces needed to be as good as they could be. On the one hand, the Railway series has better stakes and individual moments, but really lacks when it comes to pacing. It just feels like it's rushing straight to the climax, in my opinion. Meanwhile, the Model series version has better pacing, fantastic music and presentation, but doesn't fully embrace the story. There's no wind or rain, Edward's frame doesn't get all twisted up, and come on, 3 coaches, dude. And why are they like the tiniest coaches ever? Now, I understand that those shortcomings are a result of what they could and couldn't do with models at the time. And don't get me wrong, it by no means makes the story less interesting. I just wish they could have done a little more with it. Looking at both versions of this story is a little strange, since they both have good stuff in them, but they lack in something that the other version has. And it always leaves me coming away with this sense of what could have been. Next up, Percy's Promise. Original release, 1956 and 1991. Like Edward's exploit, Percy's Promise is a finale story, this time to the book Percy the Small Engine. This book was written by Wilbert Awdry, illustrated by Clarence Dalby, and later adapted into Thomas's 3rd season. I always thought it was kind of funny that this episode was made after Percy takes the plunge, despite canonically taking place before that story in the books. But looking back, I'm very glad that they held off on making this one until they were absolutely ready. The story starts with Thomas meeting up with Percy and asking the little engine if he could take the Vicar's Sunday school home after their day at the beach. Percy, overjoyed with the chance to pull passengers, eagerly agrees. But by the time they're ready to leave, the weather has taken a nasty turn. Rain, and lots of it. And while anyone would rather have a roof over their head at a time like this, Percy reminds himself why he's doing this.
A promise is a promise, he told himself. So, here goes.
The little green engine is battered by the heavy rain as he sets off, and by the time he can see what's in front of him, it isn't a pretty sight. A flash flood has swallowed the line, and water begins cascading into Percy's fire. The guard leaves to phone for help, only to return with more bad news. The bridge at the junction has collapsed, meaning they can't go back the way they came. This puts the train in an awkward situation. With a soaked fire, Percy can't build steam, and they can't even call for another engine to help them. Thinking resourcefully, the fireman, driver, and guard cut up some wood from Clarabelle's floorboards, and use that to build a fire. And as they work to get Percy's steam back, they hear a familiar whirring sound.
Oh dear, Harold's come to laugh at me. Something's thudded on Percy's boiler.
Oh, that's really too bad. He needn't throw things.
Harold isn't throwing things at you. He's dropping hot drinks for us.
With renewed resolve, Percy and his crew take a shot at crossing the flooded river. Once again, the water sloshes at Percy's fire, but he struggles on and finally reaches the other side. With a huge effort, he makes it to the station where the Fat Controller speaks to him.
Harold told me you are a wizard, Percy. He says he can beat you at some things, but not at being a submarine. I don't know what you've both been playing at, and I won't ask. But I do know that you're a really useful engine. Oh, sir.
I really love this story, both versions in fact. Unlike Edward's exploit, I don't feel like I'm missing something when I read or watch one version over the other. They both feel like complete stories in their own right, though I do tend to lean more towards the model series version. Season 3 has some beautiful summer-like visuals, and a storm episode like this takes full advantage of the lighting and colors. But that's not to say the book doesn't have some great visuals as well. Lots of people don't like this book because of the illustrations, but I think they look perfectly fine. Call it nostalgia or personal bias, but I think Dalby's illustrations are great, through and through. Next up, Gallant Old Engine. Original release, 1962 and 1995. This is a strange one for me. Unlike most people, the narrow gauge stories never really did it for me as a kid. I didn't hate them, but they always felt smaller in comparison to the main cast. And jumping into this story, I'm not gonna lie, I actually really liked it. Once again, this story was written by Wilbert Awdry, with art done by John Kenny, and would be later adapted for Thomas's 4th season. Like the last two stories, this one serves as a finale to the book Gallant Old Engine, though if you ask me, it's more of a sequel to Passengers and Polish. We start things off with Duncan bitching, as Duncan tends to do, and Skarloey trying to talk some sense into him.
Passengers are our coal and water. No passengers means no trains. No trains means no railway. Then we'd be on the scrap heap, my engine, and don't you forget it.
However, Duncan still isn't convinced. He'd stopped on the viaduct in the previous story and didn't care a bit. Skarloey can tell right away that it's going to take more than a scolding for Duncan to listen, and so he decides a little story is in order. We then flash back to way before the other engines arrived on the Skarloey Railway, back when it was just the railway's namesake and his friend Rheneas. Things were a lot harder back then. At that point, they'd been running the line for over 70 years, and were definitely showing their age. Skarloey, who previous to this had been running trains on the standard gauge railway using a conversion wagon, was completely worn out, leaving Rheneas to handle the work alone.
He was often short of steam, but he always struggled to a station and rested there. I mustn't stop between stations, he'd say. The passengers wouldn't like it.
Needless to say, one day Rheneas did stop in the wrong place. After fighting his way up a steep hill, a loud grinding is heard, and Rheneas comes to a screeching stop on the loneliest part of the line. His crew look him over, only to find that his valve gear is jammed, leaving him with only one cylinder to move the train. Despite the odds being against him, the little engine opts to press onward, knowing full well what'll happen if he didn't make it to the next station.
The thin controller's relying on me. If I fail, the railway will close. It mustn't, I'll get there or burst.
And with one final effort, he does just that, earning the good graces of his passengers and crew.
You're a gallant little engine, said the thin controller. When you're rested, we'll mend you ready for tomorrow.
And Rheneas was always ready for tomorrow. The story ends with Duncan admitting that he was wrong about passengers, and Rheneas returning home a few days later. What a story. I wasn't expecting this one to be as good as it was, and I'm specifically impressed with the books version. This was my first time looking at the RWS version alongside the TV adaptation, and while both have elements that I enjoy, I think the book's telling of the story has a particular alley-oop over the original in terms of content. Nothing about this story feels rushed, it follows a 3-act structure, and it has some stunning artwork to match. That's not to say the model series version is bad. I love the stormy weather that Rheneas has to fight through, and the golden sun that greets him when he comes through in the end. I just think the book sells the dire situation of the Skarloey Railway a bit better. And now that we've covered 3 Railway series stories and their adaptations, I think it's about time we move on to the CGI series. Next up, Henry's Hero, original release 2013. Now we're getting into the stuff that wasn't written by Wilbert Awdry, nor did it appear in the Railway series. After season 4 of Thomas and Friends, the showrunners started exclusively writing their own original stories. Sure, they would take inspiration from the books every once in a while, but for the most part, they did their own thing. Unfortunately, doing their own thing meant more and more people were brought in to write the episodes. And as time went on, the people they were bringing in became lazier and lazier. And I don't just mean using the same formula lazy, because the Railway series also follows a formula for the bulk of its stories. Heck, the 3 stories we've looked at so far follow the same structure. A character is given a job that proves to be beyond their capabilities, they run into an obstacle that stops them in their tracks, and then they find a way to work through it and come out on the other side with a win. The difference here is that these stories work because the structure they're built upon is flexible, and has competent writing to back it up. The Hit era, on the other hand, uses a formula that fundamentally doesn't work. Introduce a character, introduce a thing for that character to interact with, have the character make multiple mistakes with that thing, and then end the episode. As far as the writers were concerned, the characters were just there to serve the story, regardless of if it made sense or not. Now, to the credit of the later model seasons, they didn't always follow this structure, and every once in a while, they would pull out a story that throws you for a loop. Heck, sometimes they'd even use the 3-act structure to make something good. Major shout out to Usual Bloke Luke for his video on Percy and the oil painting. But the second you get into season 13 and beyond, all bets are off. If you've seen the Unlucky Tugs video on this era of the show, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, here's the abridged version. Every episode is the same, with no exception. A character is introduced, they're given a job, they screw it up 3 times, and then they quickly fix their mistakes, and the episode just ends with everyone being happy. Yeah, Sharon Miller really broke the bank with her story ideas. So what does this have to do with Henry's Hero? Well, this episode came out at a time when the license to Thomas and Friends was bought by Mattel, who were looking to remarket the show and turn it into something palpable for children. They brought in new writers, new animators, new everything. 2 of these writers were Paul Larson and Laura Beaumont, who wrote the script for this episode, and the story itself is actually quite good. We start things off with Henry and an original character named Hero as they're loaded up with coal for a big job. While moving a heavy load of stone, they start to notice the coal they're using is burning a dark black color and clogging their fireboxes. Henry, who's had more than a few experiences with bad coal, opts to wait until he can get some fresh, clean coal and heads back to the yard. Hero, on the other hand, is determined to get his train to the docks on time. Though the job takes longer than it would have with the Green Engine's help, Hero pulls through and gets the job done on his own. He's then told that he needs to collect another heavy train and that he'll need Henry's help to move it. Hero heads back to the yard where he finds Henry sitting in the sheds. The Japanese engine gives Henry a pep talk, boosting the big engine's confidence a bit, and the 2 set off to collect their next train. However, the bad coal the engines have been using is taking its toll, and halfway up Gordon's Hill, Hero breaks down altogether. Remembering what Hero told him, Henry decides to take a crack at getting the job done by himself. And one obvious Super Rescue reference later, he banks the entire train all the way to the docks, ending the episode. Not a bad story if I do say so myself. Seeing Henry, who at this point had been getting the shaft by the writers for give or take 4 seasons now, finally get his chance to shine again is pretty sweet. Compared to what the CGI series was serving up before, the quality is night and day here.
Nice to meet you!
But that doesn't mean that I think this story is perfect, because I don't. And that comes down to one aspect that both official and unofficial curators of Thomas stories have struggled with for years now: the dialogue. Oh my gosh, the dialogue in this story blows. Basically, a scene will play out with the narrator saying a thing, and then immediately afterwards, the character the narrator just said that thing about will reiterate the same thing, sometimes word for word.
Henry's firebox started to make some strange noises too.
My firebox is making lots of noise, hero!
It makes watching this episode so repetitive. Like, yes, I get it. There is black smoke coming from Hero's funnel. You don't have to tell me twice. It's even more frustrating because the vocal talent in this episode is actually really good. Keith Wickham as Henry fits perfectly, and Togo Egawa has some of his best deliveries in the whole show.
Well done, Henry! Keep on popping!
But holy crap, does the dialogue need a couple rewrites. It sucks. Not as bad as it was in seasons prior, but that's by no means an accolade.
That's right, boss. Boss?
What? What just happened? Moving over to the music, Robert Hartshorn wrote the music for Thomas's 17th season, and if I'm being perfectly honest, it's alright. Would I prefer a remade version of Henry's theme for this scene? Sure, of course, but I don't have the same complaints that I did with his work on the later model seasons. Overall, it's okay. And now that we've seen what the official producers can do, let's have a look at some fan-made content, starting with Edward's Fun Run, original release 2022. Back to the land of Train Simulator. This episode was written by the Jolly Mariner and adapted by YouTube user Sheffield number 14 Productions. The episode starts with Edward visiting a very worn down looking Trevor. The traction engine is in need of a new boiler, but the vicarage can't afford to have him repaired. Wanting to help his friend, Edward confides in Boko for ideas. The diesel engine tells Edward about how his driver has been participating in fun runs for charity, and Edward immediately brings the idea to the Fat Controller. Sir Topham Hatt agrees, and a few days later, the arrangements are made. Edward is to pull a non-stop passenger train across the island, with all the money from the tickets going towards Trevor's repairs. When the day comes, Edward arrives at the station to see it packed with people, and once everyone's on board, he sets off on his long trek around the island. At first, things seem to be going well. He's got an extra tanker of water, plenty of coal, and the other engines are cheering him on as he passes by. Then, they reach Gordon's Hill. While challenging on its own, the heavy train makes things even worse, and Edward is just barely able to make it to the other side. While the hardest part of the run is over, the climb used up a lot of water, and it's not long before Edward's tanker runs dry. While it's only a few more miles to the last station, Edward is beginning to tire out. And just when he thinks he might not be able to do it, he receives some encouragement from an unlikely source.
Keep it up, my dear Edward, he called. You can do it!
With newfound determination, Edward soldiers on, getting closer and closer to the finish line, until finally, he completely runs out of steam, right at the station platform. Excited cheers erupt from the passengers, and the Fat Controller congratulates Edward on a job well done. A few weeks later, Edward returns to the vicarage to see Trevor looking good as new, and the episode ends with the traction engine wholeheartedly thanking his friend, only for Edward to reply,
"Just helping a friend is all."
Like Henry's hero, there's a lot to like in this story. I'm sure we've all had those moments where we've really had to push ourselves to get over that last hurdle, and that satisfaction you feel when you finally succeed never fails to make it all worth it. But satisfying as this story may be, I still found it faltering in a few areas. For starters, the narration. On top of adapting the story, Sheffield Productions did the voice work as well, and it suffers from the all too common technical errors that knock it a few pegs down on my Thomas totem pole. Most prominent is this strange bumping sound that occurs every now and again, which I don't think would have been that hard to edit out. There's also the odd lip smack and popping noise in there as well, which, if you're like me, can be somewhat distracting. This isn't an issue exclusive to this adaptation. Heck, it's not even exclusive to fan-made work.
Well, I'm Oliver, and I'm with my brake van Toad. We've run out of coal and have no more steam.
But as someone who goes through their audio and meticulously takes out every little error, I can't help but not mention it. I'd also like to say that this video doesn't need to be 10 minutes long. It's one thing to have quiet moments in between dialogue. It's another to have shots go on for longer than they need to. With all that being said, it's certainly a fun story, and in some ways I'd even put it above episodes like Henry's Hero, just for being truer to the style of a Thomas story. Overall, a flawed but very fun episode. Next up, Rescue and Redemption, original release 2020. This story was written by The Buried Truck and adapted by the wonderfully talented group of people at Carson's Video Workshop. These guys know their stuff when it comes to trains, and this episode is a perfect example of that. This is, without a doubt, the closest any of today's selection of fan stories has gotten to mimicking the look and feel of the show. Everything about this version is polished to near perfection. The models, the colors, the lighting, the voice work, everything. The presentation feels so clean, you could legitimately pass it off as the real deal. And I'm happy to say that the quality of the story matches the presentation. We pick things up with Gordon as he's being inspected by some workmen. He finds himself unable to steam properly, and Sir Topham Hatt is forced to send him to the works for repairs. While Gordon's away, the other big engines take turns pulling the express, and none are prouder to do it than James. We're then introduced to a character who seldom appeared in the original Railway series, 7101. He'd been trying to make a good impression on the others, but his troublesome engine causes him to break down when the going gets tough. And of all the steam engines, James is by far the most fed up with having to drop whatever he's doing to rescue the diesel. A few days later, bad weather hits the island, and James is forced to double-head the heavy express with another engine. He doesn't mind the idea at first, until he sees the engine backing down in front of him.
Good morning, James, tooted 7101 cheerfully. Ready for a good run?
It'll have to be better than good, grunted James.
Like it or not though, James is stuck with the diesel engine. Despite his growling motor, 7101 proves to be great help in making it over Gordon's Hill. And the two engines reach the end of the line in no time at all, only to be met with a diesel from the other railway.
Well, Spamcan smirked. What do we have from the Nowhere Railway today? A clapped-out steamer and a non-standard diesel.
Just as James is about to give this spam can a piece of his mind, 7101 cuts in first, saying James is better than the blue diesel could ever hope to be. Of course, the diesel just laughs and dismisses the two as he rolls away. James, however, is left taken aback, having not expected 7101 to stand up for him. The next day, 7101 takes charge of the express by himself, his engine growling like a bear as he fights through the rain. He does his best to tackle the hill, but ends up stalling on the slippery rails, forcing James to come and assist. 7101 knows that Spamcan will only give him more grief for being late, but James has an idea that will put the other railway diesel in his place. The red engine buffers up behind the express, and once 7101's engine is mended, the two set off over Gordon's Hill. The two engines arrive early at the next station, much to Spamcan's surprise. He can't fathom how 7101 managed to pull such a long train on his own. Of course, he's not able to see James at the rear of the train either. And with some smug words from 7101, Spamcan rolls away in a huff just as James pulls alongside his new friend. The story ends with James suggesting a proper name for the diesel, something that suits his growling motor. And from that day on, 7101 is forever known as Bear. This story is awesome. Its pacing, its character development, it's just great. James is famously the character who never, ever liked diesel engines. Even after diesels become a mainstay on the island, he still holds a fierce prejudice against them. On the flip side, Bear doesn't get anything in the Railway series after he's introduced. He's mentioned a few times, sure, but that's it. So having a story where Bear manages to win James over and show him that diesels aren't all that bad is just so satisfying. It's overcoming odds in a different way. Physically working through a tough situation is something we're all familiar with, but getting past an emotional barrier or prejudice is, in my opinion, even harder to achieve. If there's anything negative I can say about this story, it's that there's a couple of times where the VO gets a little bit drowned out by the music, but that's literally it. Everything else in this works perfectly, and I'm genuinely surprised this wasn't a Railway series story in of itself. Next up is the two-parter, A Turning Point for Edward and End of the Line for Edward. Original release, 2017. This story was created by T1E2H3 and acts as a finale to the 4th season of The Engines of Sodor. If you recall from the last time I talked about this series, my feelings on it were mixed to say the least. There were a lot of good ideas, but the presentation was lacking in a few areas. And while I'm not going to say that every issue I had was fixed by the time this episode came out, I gotta say, this is certainly an improvement. This story follows a period in Edward's life where he feels he's getting too old for a full workload. He broaches the idea of retirement to the Fat Controller, who admits that while Edward is old, he's nowhere near ready to be withdrawn from service. Despite that, the thought of retirement lingers in Edward's mind the next day, and is only amplified when Bill and Ben manage to give him a good scare, something they've never been able to do before. And when the trucks hear that he'd been caught out by such a simple trick, they decide it's time to see just how reliable old Edward really is. Edward takes the trucks out for a run the next day, still contemplating whether or not he should retire when Edward is caught completely off guard by the sudden lurch, and before he can get the trucks back under control, they begin picking up speed. The old engine fights with the train, but his brakes just aren't strong enough to hold them back, and by the time he starts regaining control, it's too late.
The driver won't choose you again. He wants strong engines like us.
Edward is impossible. He clanks about like a lot of old iron, and he is so slow he makes us wait.
Did you see him straining?
Positively painful.
Just pathetic. He should give up and be preserved before it's too late. Edward is a useless steam pot. He should be retired.
When Bill and Ben arrive with the breakdown train, they're shocked at the sight in front of them. Edward is quickly taken to the works to be mended, where he meets with the Fat Controller. Sir Topham Hatt promises that they'll have the blue engine fixed up in no time, but for Edward, it's just not enough. He feels that he just can't go any further after an accident like that, and requests to finally be retired. While I'm sure some may say that this seems out of character for Edward, I can definitely see where he's coming from. Sure, he can be fixed whenever his parts are worn down, but mentally, he just feels completely burned out, and you can't fix that. It especially hurts knowing that he's gone almost a century without any sort of accident. You know, except for that one time his crank pin broke, or that time he lost a wheel, or when Big Mickey hit him with a boiler. But besides that, basically a spotless record. And with that, part 1 ends, and we move on to the finale. End of the line for Edward. When news gets out that Edward will be retiring, passengers and engines alike are understandably dismayed. They just can't believe he's going to stop after over a century. Edward reasons that most engines don't get a quarter of the time he's been working, and then this happens.
Besides, aren't I just a bunch of old iron? I better give up and be preserved before it's too late. Gordon hissed angrily. You listen here, Edward. We were much younger and more ignorant in those days. But you showed us time after time that you were not old iron, but an iron fist. You may not be as physically strong as the bigger engines, but by God, mentally you are the strongest of them all. Hear, hear!
Aye!
Something like this coming from Gordon is the last thing I would have expected, and it's some brilliant character development on the part of T1, E2, H3. You can tell that as the series went on, Gordon was one of his favorite characters to write stories for. And this shows so much growth from where he started. Another scene that I love comes at the climax of the story. While Edward is resting at Tidmouth Station, a heavy snow begins to fall. Not long afterwards, Gordon rushes past with his last train, and on approach to Henry's Tunnel, gets himself stuck in a massive snowbank. Edward quickly arrives on the scene and brings the coaches back to Tidmouth. But there's a problem. The station isn't big enough to hold an entire train's worth of people, and the line to Knapford is blocked by snow. That's when Edward gets an idea. The branch line goes straight to the big station, and could probably hold the weight of the express coaches. Sir Topham Hatt concedes that the plan might work, but there's no way an engine strong enough to pull the train can come down that way. To which Edward says that there is. Him. Despite knowing that it won't be easy, and that he won't have any help on the journey, he's the only engine available, and he knows he has to try.
No, I'm going to do it, not try it.
Running around to the other side of the train, Edward buffers up, grits his teeth, and sets off. It's slow going for the old engine as he battles his way through the snow, but he's not about to give up. And just like he did many years ago, Edward pulls into the station. Battered, weary, but still unbeaten. Awesome. This episode ends with Edward making his final decision. He admits he's old, outdated, and can't keep up with the full workload. But he is not about to throw in the towel, and requests to stay on the railway, a choice that is met with a chorus of whistles from the others. While I'll be the first to admit that this story isn't perfect, that by no means makes it bad. Sure, it might have peaked audio in a few places.
On! Faster! Throw him off the rails!
And some of the lines are a little awkward.
I'll tell you that Edward works harder in 1 year than you will ever in your whole lives.
And there's this. Oh my gosh, just download fucking OBS. I can't say that it's a bad story. It doesn't feel half-baked, it doesn't drag on too long, and it takes risks in telling a story that nobody is willing to tell. While it's great seeing an engine like Edward keep on pushing when the going gets tough, you can't deny that he is an old engine. And whether we want to admit it or not, age is more than just a physical thing. People suffer from burnout, they doubt their own abilities, and sometimes that doubt causes you to make mistakes. What separates this story from, say, the Hit era is that Edward still feels like Edward. He knows his limits and he's wise enough to accept them. Whereas Hit's take on Edward was, well, self-conscious for the sake of being self-conscious. While this story is a little rough around the edges, it is a fun one nonetheless. And finally, Fire Escape. Specifically, the Bluebells adaptation. Original release, 2021. The reason I chose this version of Fire Escape over the original story is twofold. A, because I think the latter Railway series stories are honestly better when they're in motion rather than just the books. And B, because I genuinely think that this is the best version of Fire Escape. The story itself was written by Christopher Awdry, son of Wilbert Awdry, and was adapted by YouTube user Bluebells using Bachmann models and practical effects. I said earlier in this video that when done well, Trains can easily keep pace with the classic series, emulating its look and feel almost scarily well. But oh my gosh, seeing something like this is such a breath of fresh air. Live models on physical sets is what made Thomas, and it's by far the toughest style to replicate. Yet with Bluebells at the helm, it feels like I'm watching the Season 8 we never got. From its comfy looking sets to its real life inspired character designs, the presentation here is on point. Now then, the story. And hey, it's not a finale this time. We pick things up with Gordon sulking in the sheds after his 2 past incidents with the Express. A literal slip-up followed by an accidental smokescreen has left him in bad graces with the Fat Controller. And he worries if he'll one day be replaced by a newer, more modern Express engine. Wanting to make up for his 2 earlier blunders, Gordon assures himself that a successful run today might put him back in Sir Topham Hatt's good books. Though, that successful run seems like a pipe dream when he's delayed by a late passenger. Thankfully, things go well once he's finally allowed to leave, but that all changes once he gets to the hill.
They were halfway up the hill when there was a clatter beneath Gordon's cab. Suddenly, he felt a blast of cold air in his middle, as if there were a gap between his boiler and cab. Oof! He gasped. What's happened? The fireman looked at his fire. There was a gaping hole in the middle where the fire bars had collapsed and a large part of the fire had disappeared.
With cold air rushing through his boiler, Gordon begins to slow down on the steep hill. His driver and firemen work quickly to block the hole and rebuild his fire the best they can.
The fireman hurried. A large lump of coal lay near the front of the tender. Quickly he moved it into place with his shovel and a long steel bar. Gordon felt better at once. Now build the fire gently round the edges, said the driver. And, as the fireman did so, the driver adjusted Gordon's controls to make the best use of his steam. Right, Gordon, he said when the fireman had finished. Now it's up to you.
Gordon tries his hardest to move the heavy train, remembering the last time he stuck on the hill. Determined not to fail again, the big engine charges bravely onwards, and before he knows it, he feels the track level out. His crew cheer him on as they finally clear the hill, and pull into the siding for a rest. While they wait for another engine to help Gordon to the next station, his passengers give him their thanks on a job well done. The story ends with Boko helping Gordon bring his train home, and the Fat Controller speaking to Gordon only to be cut short as he has to catch his next train, leaving Gordon in suspense. He knows he's done a good job, but is that enough to keep him from being replaced? What a way to end a story. I specifically love that it does end on a cliffhanger, leaving the audience wondering if Gordon's days are numbered or not. It's such a shame we never got an adaptation of this story for the TV show, but in a way, I'm kind of glad for that. This version by Bluebells has everything I'd expect from the show, and not having to compare it to something official makes it look all the better in my mind. Next up, Cross Lines. An interesting story from the later Railway series to be sure. While I wouldn't say the book it comes from has a particularly solid structure, I can't deny that the stories that came out of it are some of my favorites. And clearly, I'm not the only one, as this story has found its way into more than a few adaptations. And today, I'll be looking at and reviewing 4 of them. Going in order of release, we'll be taking a look at the original story released in 1984, the TV recreation by Live Steam from 2020, the Bluebells adaptation from 2021, and the version by Sudbury Station Master from the same year to round out our 4 options. As always, we'll kick things off with the book that started it all, the Railway series. Original release, 1984. This story was written by Christopher Awdry, the son of Wilbert Awdry, and was illustrated by Clive Spong, who worked on the Railway series from Really Useful Engines all the way up to the final book in the series, Thomas and His Friends. While I wouldn't say that Clive Spong's art was strictly better than Gunvor and Peters', I do have a soft spot for it. All the images are softer, easy on the eyes, and honestly pretty tidy looking all around. Not as spectacular as what we've seen prior, but nothing bad. Moving over to the story itself, we pick things up with James complaining about how strange diesel engines are.
They're all right, said Henry. Just mixed traffic engines like you and me. Mixed up engines, you mean, with windows at each end. How can they know if they're coming or going?
The other engines try to talk some sense into James, but in typical James fashion, he simply brushes them off. Over the next few days, the red engine becomes more and more conceited, to the point where nobody even wants to be around him. But, as is usually the case on Sodor, pride cometh before the fall. One misty morning, James is forced to shunt his own train while the other engines are busy. Because of a thick fog, the signalman in the yard finds it hard to actually see James. To remedy this, James's driver tells him that they'll whistle once they're ready to go. A foolproof plan, if they weren't in a bustling yard.
Suddenly, James heard a sharp peep peep from another engine close by.
The signalman hits the switch right as James pushes the truck over the points, causing it to travel along 2 lines at once. Before James can stop, the flat car runs right into a signal, sending it crashing to the ground. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the Fat Controller is not happy about the loss of such an important signal. The story ends with James slinking into the shed that night, only to hear a voice that puts everything into perspective.
I suppose it must be difficult to know which way to go when you've got 2 cabs. But to go 2 ways at once with only 1 cab, that really is something.
I think the reason a lot of people gravitate to this story is because it does something that the show has been struggling with for a while now. It tells a story about trains in a way only trains can tell it. When Modern Thomas wasn't trying to shoehorn plots into the show that didn't work with trains to begin with, it was turning those trains into wacky cartoon characters doing wacky cartoon things. In other words, this story uses the characters as trains doing train things, and feels as though it could happen in real life. And sure, while Chris's books might not be as renowned as Wilbert Awdry's, I will always be thankful that he managed to stick to the fundamental appeal of the Railway series. Next up, the TV recreation. Original release, 2020. It might surprise you to know that despite taking on lazy writers that didn't really care about what they put to paper most of the time, Hit never, ever tried to adapt any of Chris's later stories for TV. Why they didn't decide to take pre-made stories instead of writing their own is something I'll never understand, but because of that, we never actually got a televised version of Crosslines. What we do have, however, is one fan's best attempt at rebuilding the episode. What I mean by that is a YouTube user by the name of Live Steam took as much pre-existing footage as they could find and literally remade the episode shot for shot. The story itself follows the same plot with no alterations, but now has music, sound effects, and that wonderful model style we all know and love. And as a recreation of the original story, damn is it impressive what they were able to do. Like, you could have put this on a VHS tape and showed it to me, and I probably would have accepted it as another episode of Thomas. It's that good. Now, as a video editor, I can obviously point out a few things that don't look quite right. Gordon's face here, James's face here, you can still see some red on Jack here, and some of the stuff where Live Steam had to make all new assets kinda sticks out a bit. And while those would normally be points against the production, they're actually small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. As I said before, I'm a video editor. I work with video and audio all the time. And I can tell you from the bottom of my heart that this...
James grew so conceited that the others were glad when he was away. Shunting, he snorted. Where are Donald and Douglas? They should be here for jobs like that. Before James realized it, the truck was traveling sideways between the 2 lines.
Is exceptional. The parts that are rough don't jump out too much. The scenes where assets had to be physically moved into the shot are very well done. And it's overall just incredible how they were able to make it look so clean. As an idea of what could have been, this is certainly a wonderful way to bring the story to life. Next up, the Bluebells adaptation. Original release, 2021. Speaking of model retellings, here's another. Once again, the story remains unchanged, so let's take a look at the presentation. Now, I've talked about Bluebell's work in the past, and I love what he's been able to do here. This adaptation stands out to me in part because it's made entirely with live models, complete with custom faces and everything. I can think of very few creators who would opt for making their own custom faces over using video editing software to do the work for them, and it's such a wonderful thing to see. The engine's Railway series inspired designs, combined with the faces based off their model series counterparts, make this version of the story the best of both worlds in my mind. In an age where everyone and their grandmother has access to trains and all its fancy effects, seeing a retelling of the story that uses real models is wonderful. It's also got some really creative ideas in it as well, like how the truck that yells, "Stop!" actually has a face instead of just being another well wagon, or how the engine that the signalman mistakes for James is clearly a realistic take on Rosie. Very clever. In all, another fine display from Bluebells, and one that I can't urge you to check out strongly enough. And finally, the version by Sudbury Station Master. Original release, 2021. Can't have a video like this without looking at a Trains remake, can we? I'm sure a lot of people might be surprised I chose this particular adaptation over, say, Carson's version from 2015, or Omai Sodor's take on the story from 2020. And while yes, both of those videos are very good, this version by Sudbury Station Master is, without question, the best Trains adaptation I've ever seen. If we're going to start anywhere, we might as well start with the visuals. I don't know what kind of cracked out, muscle-bound, NASA-powered super PC this episode was made on, but what it's been able to produce emulates the Season 2 style damn near perfectly. The shots all feel like they were done on the same set back in 1986, and I adore how the story for this adaptation was tackled. At its core, it's very much the same story. James gets a big head and has an accident with a signal, but it's all the little changes to the continuity of the story that make it stand out. This story takes place directly after the events of Edward's exploit, and actually shows us a bit of how Boko gets on while Edward is at the works. And him becoming a mainstay on the island brings out James's distrust for diesels far more than what the Audreys did in the Railway series. And best of all the little technical bits of dialogue have been smoothed out so that the story doesn't waste any motion. Everything is so tightly packed together and never feels like it's dragging from one part to the next. And with a new take on the story comes brand new animation, and once again, they did not disappoint. Unlike me, who said animation instead of narration in the voice booth, and now has no way to fix it. Fuck. YouTube user DCG12B lends his voice to the story, and is, without question, the thing that makes this whole episode come together. I'm not joking around either, I literally only got one take of the line, I was like, yep, sounds good to me. If you've seen this show before, then you know that I do not care how good an episode looks if the narration falls flat. Whether that be peaked audio,
"Your trains don't matter so much, but I've got to pull the express,"
or a strange delivery,
"You're Hank Rank to me. You gave me a name, which doesn't sound like much, but for a shabby brake van, it was a big deal."
Or whatever the heck is going on with Daisy's voice here.
"Perhaps you should leave your passengers to me. I never struggle on hills."
Poor narration can bring down a perfectly fine story. And in that same breath, I think a good narration can boost a less than superb presentation. Just look at Jimmy the Ginty, a series created by DCG. Sure, it doesn't look particularly grandiose, but good narration and solid storytelling help fill in the gaps.
John was as tough as they come, but even he felt nervous at the realization that lay before those engines. "Awful, isn't it?" muttered Horwich. "Aye. But that's not going to be us," huffed John firmly. "We're getting out of here."
However, when the presentation and narration are at their peak, that's when you've reached a level that can compete with the main product. And as far as this episode is concerned, if I were Mattel, I'd be making some business calls right about now. Next up, Trucks. A Railway series story that any fan of the Narrow Gauge gang knows all too well. It's one of the few stories set on the Skarloey Railway that doesn't feature the titular character, and was begging to be adapted into model life. So much so that they couldn't help but do it more than once, with each interpretation of the story being just different enough to make them stand out. And today, I'll be looking at and reviewing 4 of them. Going in order of release, I'll be taking a look at the original story from 1959, the Season 3 adaptation from 1992, the Season 4 adaptation from 1995, and finally, the version by Roman's TWR Empire to round out our 4 options. So, with all that out of the way, let's dive in, starting with the Railway series. Original release, 1959. This version was written by Wilbert Awdry, with phenomenal art done by John Kenny. Out of all the illustrators that worked on the Railway series, I think John Kenny has the best take on the narrow gauge engines. There's something about the scaling and the character designs that edges out over the other illustrators in my mind. And with the exception of Peter Sam's crash, where it's basically the exact same shot, everything checks out on a visual front. But as always, visuals don't mean much without a solid story, so let's have a look, shall we? We start things off with Peter Sam and Sir Handel running the railway while Skarloey is away for repairs. Sir Handel, feeling overworked and degraded with having to shunt his own trains, gets some advice from Gordon.
Our controllers don't understand our feelings. Now, if you were ill, you couldn't go, could you? Good idea. I'll try it.
The next day, Sir Handel puts Gordon's plan into action, leaving Peter Sam to pick up the slack. The cheerful little engine is coupled to Sir Handel's trucks and brings them to the incline where they're to be loaded with slate. However, the trucks, expecting Sir Handel to be waiting at the bottom of the hill, hatch a plan of their own. Pulling at the winch, they cause the rope to snap and come plummeting down the incline.
Ouch! I didn't expect a cold bath.
The little green engine is pulled from the wreckage and limps back to the shed, where he and the thin controller give Sir Handel a piece of their minds, leaving the arrogant engine wondering if this whole scheme was really worth it. A solid story, and one that actually has some consequence for Peter Sam down the road. However, while a perfectly fine story to kick off the book, I do still have some problems with it. For one, you might have noticed that throughout that entire summary, I failed to mention the existence of Rusty. Yeah, he gets introduced in this first story. And what do they do to introduce him? Nothing. He's just here now, and this is one of the few stories where he actually speaks. This is an issue I don't think enough people give attention to when looking critically at the Railway series. For as fun of a storyteller as Awdry could be, he had a bad habit of introducing a character, giving them a couple stories, and then just forgetting about them. This happens everywhere in the series, with Trevor, Daisy, Harold, Terrence, Bertie, Bill and Ben, the list goes on. These are all very fun characters who had the potential for exciting stories, and in my opinion, both Wilbert and Christopher kind of squandered them. Now yes, not every character that was introduced needed their own set of stories. I'm sure we're not missing out on some grand epic involving Toad the Brake Van. But then when I look at all the amazing fan stories that use these lesser characters, I can't help but wonder what might have been if the publishers didn't demand more Thomas. Now, with the original story out of the way, it's time to move on to the first televised version, Trust Thomas. Original release, 1992. This might be a surprising entry for some of you, as I don't think most people would consider this an adaptation to Trucks, and I can totally see why. It focuses on a completely different cast of characters, with James and Thomas taking the roles of Sir Handel and Peter Sam respectively, and the story is structured very differently. However, like with Edward the Very Useful Engine, I think the classic series team decided that instead of making all new props to adapt a single story, they'd instead take what they already had and try to make the best of it. Only to go back and adapt it in its original format anyways, but we'll get there. As always, we'll start with the story. We pick things up with Thomas on his branch line, where he meets up with a very cross-looking Bertie. The bus complains to Thomas about the state of the roads, and how it's the railway's fault for not bringing the tar they promised. Though it's an incredibly small detail, I love that when Bertie says,
"You can't trust a thing that runs on rails. I run on rails. You can trust me, Bertie. I'll see if I can find out what's happened,"
is Thomas's immediate reply. In past seasons, Thomas would respond to even the tiniest bit of teasing or frustration with immediate aggression. If you made him look bad, he'd be giving you shit for a long time afterwards. He was basically the personification of throwing stones from your glass house.
Blue is the only color for a really useful engine. Everyone knows that.
Oh God! Oh God! Oh God! Oh my God!
The Awdrys like to do this a lot with their characters, where someone like Gordon or James or Percy would say something pompous or act like they're all that, only for karma to come back and bite them in full force. And I don't think it was a coincidence that when the writing team was given the freedom to start creating their own stories, they chose to start softening Thomas up a little, and gave him more chances to be a good guy rather than immediately round on the people he calls his friends.
Fancy a really useful blue engine like Thomas becoming a disgrace to Sir Topham Hatt's railway.
Fuck you.
So Thomas heads back to the yards to see about the tar, where an impatient James is banging around with the freight cars. He grumbles to Gordon about how he shouldn't have to put up with all this dirty work, only for Gordon to go and give him the same advice he gave Sir Handel in Trucks. James takes the bait, of course, and the two engines con Thomas into running up to the quarry. However, the freight cars that James was shunting are fed up with being treated like trash. And then this happens.
Go faster, go faster. Slow down, called Thomas's driver, and applied the brakes.
This is easily one of my favorite crashes in the whole series. An engine coming off the rails is nothing new for Thomas and friends, but you can only show the engines crashing into shit so many times before it starts to get boring. In my mind, part of what makes a good crash is the set pieces surrounding it. Some good examples are a better view for Gordon, Thomas comes to breakfast, Percy's chocolate crunch, and so on. Realistic or not, seeing Thomas practically water ski across a pond on a car ferry is way cooler of a visual than just getting a little bent out of shape. But with all that being said, this scene does have one flaw to it that I only noticed when I came back to it for this review, and it kinda messes things up a little. How the heck did Thomas get switched onto a track that basically led into a dead-end siding? What happened there? Surely he wasn't planning on using the car ferry to get across, considering he's at the front of the train, and the car ferry starts to sink once he reaches the other side. And it's not like that's the only line he could have gone down, as when Duck arrives to take the train on, he goes down a different track. Why they didn't just make it a single track with a disused siding and some faulty points, I'll never know. But it did take this whole scene down a peg for me personally. Regardless, Edward arrives to take Thomas back to the yard, and on the way, the little engine asks about the tar meant for the roads. As luck would have it, that tanker of tar had been dropped off at Edward's station by mistake, and the blue engine promises to have it delivered to the branch line right away. The story wraps up with James and Gordon apologizing to Thomas for his accident, and Bertie thanking Thomas for the missing tar. This episode, from a narrative perspective, is actually pretty impressive, as it manages to tell two congruent storylines that motivate one another to their respective conclusions. Considering that the episode only has 4.5 minutes to work with, that's quite a feat. It has a clear start, middle, and end, and doesn't waste any motion with either of its plot lines. And considering how wonky I thought the original story was in a few areas, this is quite an improvement. As far as presentation goes, I'd be lying if I said the Season 3 visuals don't do a ton of heavy lifting. This episode in particular uses a bunch of one-off sets that I want to go there, gosh dang it. That opening visual at the beginning is one of my favorite sets in the whole series. The cinematography is pretty solid too, though I wish they would have filmed on a day when they weren't being pestered by an earthquake. On the side of narration, this was my first time experiencing the UK version of the story.
Thomas the Tank Engine was feeling bright and cheerful. It was a splendid day.
I think Michael Angelis is a great narrator, though he can talk a little too fast at points, which I feel throws off the timings in a few places in this episode in particular. Though that could just be because I grew up watching the US dub with the ever-fantastic George Carlin.
We couldn't pay James back for bumping us, so we'll play tricks on Thomas instead. One engine is as good as another.
Regardless of which narrator you prefer, I think they're both more than serviceable in their own right. Musically, and I probably sound like a broken record for saying this, but this soundtrack is great. The music has its moments to shine, while also being able to sink into the background while the narrator is speaking, with my favorite pieces being the bit that plays at the beginning and the ditty during Thomas's crash. Next up, the Season 4 adaptation. Original release, 1995. Time for a more traditional adaptation. Like I said in my video about Thomas's underdog stories, I've never really had the desire to revisit the narrow gauge episodes. More often than not, if I'm rewatching the show, I'm going back to the main cast. And like with last time, I actually really enjoyed this episode. The story is fairly faithful to the original, so instead, let's go over some changes. For starters, the character designs. If there's one thing that I don't like about the Railway series interpretation of the Scar-Loey engines, it's that they all have the exact same paintwork. Now, I get why Audrey asked them to be drawn like this. It's the Railway's livery. You want to keep them all consistent. But when all your characters look so similar to one another, it makes you want to have a little variety. It's really similar to how Dragon Ball kept including more and more Saiyan characters and pushing them to the forefront, and in many cases benching what were once main characters. But anyway, back to Thomas. I think that making all of them different colors was a really smart move. Instead of everyone being red, here Peter Sam is green, Rusty's orange, Sir Handel's blue. And they all just pop a lot more than they did in the Railway series. Speaking of Rusty, holy crap did they fix him up for this story. Instead of just showing up like he does in the books, he actually has a short scene at the beginning and the end of the episode that lets us get to know him a bit better. It's a small change, but it's so much less jarring than just thrusting him onto us out of the blue. Compare that to the Railway series where we don't even see him until the penultimate illustration, and I think you can understand why I like this change so much. So right off the bat, we're off to a really strong start. Then we come to the crash scene, and this admittedly has me split. On the one hand, this scene has one of the most gnarly crashes of the whole show. You really feel the impact when Peter Sam gets hit, and before you can even process what just happened, it's over. It's a great scene that shows off the advantage of using physical models over CGI, but it still has a couple of problems. Let's get the lesser of the two out of the way first. I've seen a lot of people say that this scene works better in the Railway series, where Peter Sam and Sir Handel have the same liveries, and so it's more believable that the trucks can mistake one for the other. And for the most part, I agree. Kinda. I don't think this one scene not making sense would have justified painting Peter Sam red to match Skarloey. I still think that having some visual variety amongst the narrow gauge engines far outweighs the tiny little plot hole that this telling of the story has. No, instead, I think what should have been changed was the set. Had Peter Sam been placed slightly more around the corner, or if the buildings obscured him more, I think this scene would have worked a lot better. Maybe I could suspend my disbelief enough to think that the trucks were so high up they couldn't see Peter Sam as well. I mean, the narrator does say that in the episode, so Anyways, that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 comes with the crash itself.
Peter Sam shut his...
Did you see it? Here, let me play it back for you in slow motion. Notice anything now? Yeah, the editing crew just spliced 2 shots together with the most jarring jump cut imaginable. Now yeah, I get it, they wanted the crash to go a certain way, but just pick one shot. Either of these crashes would have been fine on their own, and once you cut away to another shot, you're free to slightly adjust things to fit your needs. As long as you're not breaking continuity, you're all good there. Instead, they just decided to put these 2 shots together, and I'm sorry, it doesn't look very good. And if you really want to argue that the second crash is the other set of trucks coming down the hill, then at the very least change the camera angle to reflect that. There's absolutely no reason that the crash couldn't have looked like this. See, it still works just as well without any weird cut to another clip. I think people underestimate just how easily the imagination can fill in the gaps where necessary. This could have looked so much better if they had just chosen one take or used another angle. With that being said, I still think that this adaptation has a lot more going for it than not, and while the crash is fucky, it's still a marvel in terms of practical effects. I just wish it had been edited a little better. And last but not least, the adaptation by Roman's TWR Empire. Original release, 2018. This remake was made using Thomas wooden railway models, a type of toy that I actually really like aesthetically. They're not the most accurate to anything, but they've got a nice charm to them. The adaptation itself is nearly a one-to-one shot recreation of trucks. Making a remake like this can always be a bit of a double-edged sword, I've found, because from a filmmaking perspective, you're trying to reinvent something that visually already looks amazing, without adding any elements to make it stand out. There's no extra scenes that weren't implied in the book, it's just taking what was there and wooden railwayifying it. But, as it is, this is a dang good remake if I do say so myself, with plenty of creative ideas that I really like. The first being the attempt to show off the difference between narrow gauge and standard gauge using wooden railway and Tomy models respectively. Now, this isn't like a groundbreaking idea, I have seen other creators do this in the past, but it's still not very common, and it's a really nice detail that I think more people should try to do if they have the resources. It kind of makes it feel like we're reenacting the story out ourselves using our own toys. A genuine improvement this remake made was the crash at the slate quarry. Even without the literal destruction of props, this just looks so much cleaner from an editing perspective. Just one shot, no weird cuts, looks great. And the superimposed faces are pretty solid, for the most part. There are a few times where, thanks to the cameraman bouncing around like he's on crack, things look a little weird. Of course, this isn't Roman's fault, this is well and truly out of his control, and I don't expect him to pull off some stupid After Effects bullshit to fix this. But if I had to give a suggestion, it would be to use a still frame of the faces instead of a video feed. You won't get the eyes moving, but it'll keep the bouncing at bay. All in all, this is a really solid remake. Hey there. It's the end of the video, and I don't really have any more footage or narration to show off, so for the time being, here's the timeline for the next video I'm working on. I just want to say a few really quick things. I won't take up too much of your time. You've watched a lot of stuff if you have made it to the end of this, so I'll keep it brief. Working on this series has done a lot for me. It has taught me so much about writing, editing, narrating, graphic design, audio, all that stuff. And I don't think I would have gotten to this point if it wasn't for you, the viewer tuning in to watch these videos. You have been one of the driving forces behind my improvement as a creator, essentially. And that means the world to me in a way that I can't really describe with words alone. I'm not good at showing emotion, as you can probably tell by my very monotone voice, but truly, thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in and giving a shit about what I have to say, because gosh dang it, do I have a lot of opinions. And sometimes I can't help but go off the rails a little bit while giving them. So really, thank you. I also want to give a few special shout outs while we're here. Thank you so much to the following people: Usual Bloke Luke, Thomas Theorist, Scrapyard Studios, Liam Miller, Carson's Video Workshop, Israeli Government, not the actual government, the YouTube channel, the NWR Chris, The Unlucky Tug, and, of course, Totally Not Mark. These people, though I have not spoken to all of them or met all of them, are incredible inspirations to me, as are so many other people in the Thomas fandom who I don't even have time to list them all. We'd be here for hours. You are the reason that these videos are possible. So, yeah, that's all I got for today. Until next time, take care.